Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Amartya Singh, co founder and CEO of Inflow, a product built by and for modern finance teams. So, we're back with the 16th episode of our podcast under the Inside the CFO Office series, your go to space to hear real stories from finance leaders who have shaped, scaled, and streamlined their organizations. From career defining moments to the challenges they have sought and their take on where finance is headed next. In today's episode, we have as our guest Jason, the head of finance operations at ClickUp, and a finance leader with a uniquely broad background spanning business development, cash collections, deal desk revenue operations, and business leadership across global firms like Cvent. Jason brings a unique cross functional lens to the CFO's office. He's led enterprise wide change and transformations, aligned revenue critical teams, and driven operational efficiency at scale. He's entrepreneurial. Today at ClickUp, he's helping shape the future of finance ops in a fast growing SaaS environment. His journey reflects how the role of a finance operation leader has grown from being a back office function to a mission critical enabler of business velocity with inclusion of strategy. So, welcome, Jason. Great to have you with us in today's podcast.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Thanks, Jason. So let's dig into the podcast. Let's start off from a question about your background and about the growth. So you have grown from a business development executive to the head of finance operations. It's been quite a journey, right? And now you're leading finance operations at ClickUp. So what were some of the most critical and pivotal career moments that shaped your transition and growth to the role?
All right. So I started cold calling association leads back in right after college, about 20 years ago, and that was really hard work. Back then, the first sales resource I got was literally just a book, a very large book, full of association names and data points, and we had to go figure out who to call and try to weave through gatekeepers and dial expired phone numbers and deal with people who had left organizations. So you're calling asking for somebody who worked there 2 years ago. And it's very different now. And I think people who are beginning their sales career today and think that they're cold calling, and certainly they are in the context of how it works today, but it's very different than it was a couple of decades ago. And so I carried with me throughout all the years a very deep understanding and appreciation for how difficult that job is and how critical those roles are. And as I grew within the sales organization, eventually into a leadership role, within a few years, responsibilities got more and more significant. I was very young then, so it was a little bit overwhelming, frankly. And I think that perspective has kind of stuck with me through all of the different roles that I've had and all the different things that I've touched over the years. And so, look, there's no SaaS company that can't function without its sales organization. The revenue is the key driver in every metric and every decision that gets made at a high level. And so having an appreciation and actually being able to look back and remember doing the job, not just understanding the job and working with people, but actually being the one to execute on it, I think is an extremely valuable experience that I have that's somewhat unusual in the finance world. From there, I sort of pivoted around and moved into operations, stood up the procurement team at Cvent, my previous company. I was there for about 18 years, give or take. And so throughout all of those different things, I found myself constantly interacting with and touching finance in some way, whether it was customer retention, billing issues, payment services, budget planning, commission planning. It was like a never ending stream. It seemed like I was just always talking to somebody in finance every time I turned around. And so eventually when the opportunity came to sort of sit within the finance organization, I already had some degree of comfort with it. It didn't scare me as much as it does other people sort of moving into a finance role for the first time. And so as I've continued to grow my responsibilities, I've tried to carry all of those different pieces of experience with me to help kind of shape my views and help me to make better decisions that have context outside of just what my technical job is and what my technical responsibilities are.
Got it. So I think one important thing you mentioned is about doing the job, right? I think that's very important, and especially in operations, right? You have to get things done, right? If you want to get that particular goal achieved or a particular thing implemented, it's very important to not get distracted by other things. It's very important to have, this is the goal that I want to reach out to, and these are the things that I need to do, right? And that rigor to get that thing done, that discipline to get that thing done, I think I got it from where it came from, right? From the cold calling experience, right? Cold calling is difficult, right? I also have done cold calling. It's very difficult, you reach out to people, people tell no, people can be rude, and you have targets to meet, you have conclusions to do. I think that's where, I mean, as you mentioned, it was a very right time for you when you were young, and there was a lot of experimentations with the work, a lot of learnings, and taking the hardships or taking the failures head on, right? That, I think, forms a base of it. And then from that point onwards, the act of just doing it and figuring it out, and that fitment with finance, right? If you look at the way finance has shaped up, right, I believe the entire processes of where finance teams work, the tech of finance teams, everything is so detail oriented that you cannot just do things without any detail, without getting into operationally active. So I think as a finance leader, I think operations is one of the most thing, the eye to detail, getting things done, working with your team. So I really appreciate how you have worked towards getting really good at finance operations.
Yeah, appreciate that. It's been a very strange journey. I think a lot of my more recent experience, and probably the most profound challenge that I had prior to moving to ClickUp, was actually around cash collections.
Right.
And that was a role that I'd moved into and out of sort of over the years. Prior at this event, there were certain times during, for example, the first sort of financial crisis, the Great Recession, was a time that I was sort of transitioning from sales to operations and kind of assisting with what we at the time just thought was sort of a special project in dealing with customers that were at risk, and really focusing more on logo retention rather than cash retention, because customers were in pain and they expected us as partners to share that pain to some degree. And so, after that, I sort of stepped into more of a procurement and operational role, circled back to that a bit during COVID, and assisted with the customer facing teams and their response to that. But it was definitely, one of the most difficult, but also rewarding roles that I ever had. I think that the amount of cross-functional collaboration required to execute from a cash collection perspective is really extraordinary. And I've seen organizations that don't do it well, where the collections team kind of sits in its own silo, makes its own decisions, follows its own playbook. And I've seen organizations where it works extremely well, because the leadership is integrated with the sales and the service organization and other leaders across the company. And so they're making decisions and policy decisions and procedural updates with the proper context, understanding the customer journey and also understanding the cash journey. But you have to, you can't view just the cash journey without the context of the customer journey, which isn't to say that the customer is always right. That's not always the case, unfortunately. But the customer always does have a perspective, and you have to understand from that perspective what it is they're actually asking you about. The vast majority of customer disputes, in my experience, have very little to do with money. They usually have to do with something else, a product failure, something was missold, they're not achieving their objectives. I could list 100 things, but very rarely is it just a matter of, hey, we don't want to pay our bill because we don't like you. That's pretty unusual. And those are actually the easiest billing cases to deal with, because they're very transparent. There's always something else going on under the scenes. But if you don't have those communication streams with your traditional customer facing departments and organizations, you're not going to have the context to be able to respond effectively and to engineer the processes to deal with those things at scale.
Got it. No, I think, and the approach itself is really great of yours. You mentioned a few things from the functional perspective. You mentioned about cash collection, procurement, customer facing functions. So there's a gamut of experience over there. And I think one interesting perspective you mentioned was that, logo retention versus cash retention. And that's always like a balance. So if you look at from the sales and a key account perspective, typically the logo retention is important. From the finance perspective, the cash retention is important.
Right.
And there's always a battle, right? And you say that, hey, we can't lose this customer. This has given us $100,000, and we are stuck with $50,000, but we have $100,000. We should keep servicing. We should not stop their work, because that's money which we can get, and that's already booked. You've already built the revenue, and you have to go and do a lot of changes. So it's always a battle, right? And it's not an easy battle. And I think I loved your answer with regards to understanding the customer perspective, right? as you rightly said, there's no that customers do not paying because they don't like you, and there is a specific reason. So either there is a background towards a customer not paying. It's very important to understand the perspective, even though you cannot do anything about it, but it gives you a right sort of understanding exactly why the customer is not making a payment. It helps your forecasting, it helps your understanding your cash better, it helps your cash flows, and it just gives you a realism in terms of what to expect and what not to expect.
Yeah, it's not just a battle. It's also a balance that has to be struck.
Yeah.
Logo
Right.
retention is important. Cash retention is important. They both
Right.
have a seat at the table. But
Right.
there will be times in a company's journey where one's importance can grow and shrink compared to the other, right?
Right.
So during good times, when you're at high growth companies, such as where Cvent kind of was for most of my journey and where ClickUp is today, cash explosion and revenue growth is really the principal driver behind most decisions. But when things were difficult, when there was a recession, or certainly during the pandemic, things were difficult for a variety of reasons that had customer and company impacts. And even some things we're seeing today around economic uncertainty have created a little bit of customer, I don't want to say unwillingness, but some customers are just hesitant to make long-term purchasing decisions in the current economic climate.
Right.
And, it's not nearly as big of an impact as the Great Recession was or as COVID was, certainly, but there is still an impact there. And during those times, logo retention can often be a strategy that in the long term is going to pay off a lot better than purely revenue retention. Because if you can keep those customers that genuinely appreciate your product, hopefully they'll get back to a phase of reinvestment and growth once the crisis has passed. If you take a purely revenue lens to that situation, you're probably going to lose a lot of customers that you could have kept. And those customers may not be as valuable as you hoped they were in the short term, but you have to hope that your sales organization has sold good customers that have that growth potential. And sometimes the journey doesn't look the way you think it does. You sell a customer. I sold a house in February of 2020. I had no idea that in March of 2020, the world was going to change, and that would have been worth 50-60% more if I held on to it for another few years, right? I missed out. It was still a good deal at the time and the context, but that journey was different than I could anticipate. Customers go through the same thing. They buy with a plan, certain hopes, certain ambitions for their business, and sometimes they get there and the path is different, takes longer, takes a different route than anticipated.
Great. I think you gave a good understanding about having the balance between the logo retention, and coming from your side is really important because today's finance leaders are thinking like, true business people. They're thinking and empathizing with the customer. They're thinking about the growth of the business, and this is really important, right? Finance people can really focus just on the cash back because that's roles and responsibility number one. But it's very important because company grows, finance leaders grow with them, and hence everybody grows. And that's the kind of collaborative mindset that is really required. So loved your answer. So I think let's move to the next question. From the finance operations side, I'd like to know what are the two most significant challenges that you have faced?
The biggest one that stands out was actually a sort of project that stood by itself. And this was about 10 to 12 years ago is when this occurred, between about 13 and 15. And Cvent was prepared to relocate their company headquarters. Was an option. There was also an option to stay in the building we were in, but there were a lot of challenges with growing within that building. I had zero experience at this time with commercial real estate, construction, project management. I had no clue what I was doing. I genuinely was just making it up as I went. But fortunately, we had leaders who were able to help sort of guide me through that and trusted me to sort of dig in and figure it out. But from start to finish, it was probably a 2-year plus project that started with just the initial sort of assessment of, hey, what are our options where we're at? Let's go out in the market and see what's available around us. So, we ultimately ended up sourcing off-market space, which was a very challenging thing to do. If you've never had to try to find real estate that's not for sale and buy it, it's pretty difficult. Of course, we had brokers who assisted with that process. We had a lot of other professionals that we brought in different areas. It wasn't just me, of course, but that was an extremely tricky thing to navigate. Very large lease negotiation, by far the largest contract the company had ever signed. Negotiating economic incentives with state and counties and understanding those dynamics was something I'd never even thought of. My naivety got the best of me. I didn't realize that governments would pay companies just to stay in a jurisdiction. So I learned that lesson pretty quick, but that was a very strange thing and I had a, government and public administration is what my actual degree was in, right? So it really floored me as someone who had studied government and was a reasonably informed taxpayer. That, hey, there's a lot of money you can get from the government to decide where your company is going to just employ people, right? And then it was, the design of the space, the architects, the furniture systems, the actual construction, which included a very large network operations center, which is a highly technical process. So just so many things went into that. I remember having to source the glass and the conference rooms from a foreign country to deal with shipping and tariffs and customs issues. And so that was a once in a career experience. I loved just the raw enormity of that challenge was really something special that I hope to never have to do again, frankly. But man, that was a big learning experience for me. And it involved strong buy-in from every division, every leader in the company. So that was by far the hardest thing I've ever done. The second time was really two events that were similar, the financial crisis and COVID. In both of those cases, our customers were hit very hard. Demand had plummeted. Customers were unable to fulfill the obligations of their contracts. And we had to find a way to retain those customers and try to ensure that we were making the best long-term decisions for the business, even if it was very, very painful for us in the short term. And that was, both of those events were extraordinarily challenging in their own right. But we learned a lot of very valuable lessons from the financial crisis that we were able to sort of undust and reuse at a much larger scale during COVID. And the biggest takeaway that I got from that is that you have to plan for bad events to happen. Sometimes you're surprised by them, but once the event has passed, you don't just move on and hope it never happens again. You have to do the postmortems, you have to do the lesson learning, you have to do the engineering to make sure that if it happens again in the future, you're better prepared for it. That was extremely valuable to us when another crisis hit years later, but had effectively the same impact at a larger scale.
Got it. Great. I think I love the two answers. The first answer with regards to the commercial real estate and the entire getting out of your comfort zone and doing something which is really required. I mean, obviously there are some things about the general work that we do. It can be something like finance processes, technology, team management, hiring. It can be those kind of roles and responsibilities. But then all of a sudden you get some kind of a role which you got to do. I mean, understanding, you're talking about rules and regulation, you're talking about laws, you're talking about speaking with people you have never interacted with them in the life, going out to and understanding. So I'm sure that must have been a great experience. And I also, the thrill of it and the scare of it must have been really, really a great experience, because it also teaches you to, I mean, it gives you that kind of life experience that, hey, if even if you are given a problem statement out of comfort zone, you will be able to do it.
Yeah. And the advice I would pass along to anybody in these types of roles is this. And I heard this quote from somewhere. I'm not sure where it came from. It's certainly not mine. So we'll have to attribute it to someone. The saying was something to the effect of, if you're offered a ride on a rocket ship, don't ask what seat it is. Just get on board and go for the ride. And so the construction project, the headquarters relocation, was one of those times where it was, this is big, this is scary. I genuinely don't know what I'm doing and what I'm getting myself into. But I know that it's going to be a career defining moment. And I know that I just need to raise my hand and say, give me a shot at this. I want to do it. I want the challenge. And I think sometimes people are afraid to do that, because what happens if you fail? If you break that project down into the 200 sort of subtasks that it required, I probably screwed up 20, 30% of them in a significant fashion. All of those were learning lessons and allowed me to better make decisions for the next step in the process. And so if you have an opportunity to expand your knowledge and to participate in something that's truly just an unusual opportunity, take it. Just do it.
Sharing your experiences with the challenges that you have faced. I mean, let's go to the transformation, right? Obviously, in operations, transformations are some of the constant things that you need to do. So you have led large scale transformation across functions. What was the most impactful transformation project that you have seen?
The most impactful was probably back at CVent. Most of our customers processed credit card payments to accept registration fees for their events. And years had gone by where the system was pretty simple. We're going to give you what's called a payment gateway. You'll attach it to your bank. The money's going to flow to your bank. You're all set. And we looked at the situation one day, and we had a lot of customers saying, hey, can you process the payments for us? We don't feel like going through the process of getting the bank account and setting this up. It's all technical and scary. And so we kind of turned around one day and said, yeah, let's give it a shot. Let's literally build this new service from scratch and figure out how to handle the customers who have this requirement that's preventing us from getting other business, right? It also required absorbing a lot of risk for the company that we had previously shied away from. But it was our way of saying, hey, we're willing to accept some risk here because we feel that there's a need in the market for this, and it helps us with our software revenue. So we built the systems, built the processes. There were a few different teams involved, and it wasn't actually that complicated the first time that we did it. It was relatively straightforward. But like many other things, the first process you build isn't built for scale. It's built to solve the initial problem and the initial influx of customers. But when you're in a massive growth trajectory, eventually you're going to get to the point that that system breaks, where that foundation cracks and it just can't keep up with the demand. So many years later, I'd sort of circled back to this, and we built a new system to replace the old system. And it genuinely transformed not just how our customers interacted with us from a payment perspective, but how our entire finance organization interacted with our customers, because the customer journey had gotten very, very poor. It took a long time to get back to people. There was a lot of inaccuracy. It was very frustrating for customers to use this service that was designed to be quick and simple, but it was never designed to handle that massive volume that came years later as it compounded. And so transforming that process is much more difficult. It was akin to, it's pretty easy to change the oil in a car that's parked in the garage. We were trying to change the oil while the car was cruising at highway speed, which is much, much more challenging. And so accomplishing that was a big deal. But the transformation really came in reframing how we handled customer interactions from the finance organization, which is often not customer facing outside of maybe billing and collections, but customer facing to customers that should be happy, where we're effectively doing customer service, but with the financial background and the financial tools to answer a very specific type of question, but a question that's really, really critical. You're playing with people's money is how they perceive it when there's a company income and revenue. It's just important for your customers as it is for your company. And so being able to transform how our customers perceived that service and how our finance organization perceived their responsibility to be customer facing was a big deal. That was a very hard thing to accomplish and something I'm very proud to have been a part of.
Got it. Great experience. I think the entire project also transformed from a simple problem statement of doing payment processing to, managing customer expectations, understand how to scale, understanding how to handle the customer interaction touch points, because there are so many transactions happening, processing issues, settlement issues, chargeback issues, gamut of things, right? On the outside, it is not that complicated. Once you start scaling, it becomes really easy to manage.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We could handle chargebacks and disputes manually the first year, right? When a few customers were using it, you get to a point where you've got hundreds or thousands of customers and you're processing, into the hundreds of millions or potentially more on an annual basis. Right. Those paper cuts start to become very deep wounds, and you can't fix them with a Band-Aid any longer. And so, what you build today based on what you know today might be a very good decision. Right. It doesn't mean it's still going to be a good decision 3 years down the road. And so you always have to have a willingness to not assume that things are working as well as they could just because they once did. Something that was a part of your company's past doesn't have to be a part of the company's future. And it doesn't matter who built it. There's nothing so sacred that it can't be reviewed and updated and modernized if it makes sense to do that, particularly if it's jeopardizing revenue or creating a poor customer journey. Take a look at it and say, can we do this better? Can we transform this?
Right.
We don't have to just keep doing it the way we've always done it.
Got it. No, great answer. I think let's move to the next part, and this is one of my favorite sections. I would love to know your take on technology. Like the CFO landscape has evolved over the last, couple of 2-3 decades. Would love to know how are you seeing the entire evolution of the CFO landscape, tech landscape, and especially how do you see AI impacting it?
Yeah, so I view the finance tech stack generally as outdated and sticky and stale. I don't think it's any secret that finance systems are very hard to rip out and transfer from product A to product B. Software companies like ClickUp and like Cvent, like pretty much any other software company I've ever had an interaction with, would much rather spend their time and resources developing customer-facing, revenue-generating product than dealing with back office issues. And so I think that has created an environment where the financial technology providers have often underinvested in their products. The user interfaces are often antiquated. The systems can be buggy or slow, and they're just not iterating and developing and evolving as fast as other systems. You look at the sales tech stack. To be fair, I've never seen a sales tech stack that's not an enormous mess. 10 products that have a degree of overlap with each other, and there's a system for this thing and a system for that thing, and it's so much technology. But when you peel it off and you look at those technologies, they tend to be systems that are highly innovative. The reason they keep replacing one another is because these companies are really fighting hard to provide the best possible outcomes, the highest ROI, the most efficiency, the most effectiveness. Where in the finance space, it doesn't seem like that's the case in general. And so I believe that there's a big opportunity there for finance technology providers to change that perspective and to develop their products better and faster rather than just effectively amassing market share that's very sticky, because it's hard. We look at when we renew software contracts for sales, I'll get sales leaders who come to me and say, "You're not replacing that. We love that product and you're not getting rid of it. My sales team will quit." Now, they're probably being dramatic, but the fact that they're willing to go that far and advocate for it, pretty eye-opening. Where when I talk to people in the finance organization about their products, it's more like, "Yeah, we have to renew it." That's like the ringing endorsement is, "Oh, we need to have it. Of course we need to have it. It's too painful to switch, and there's really nothing in the market that's that much better anyway. So yeah, whatever, go renew the contract." And it's amazing how different the perspective is. And it's not because people in finance are boring. It's because their products are boring. And it's because the people who develop and support those products aren't creating things that carry that excitement, that are not cutting edge, that don't have that perception, right? And so I think AI is an opportunity to be more transformative in that regard. What I've seen so far, and we have a weird perspective on this at ClickUp, because not only do we assess AI tools for our consumption as any other company would, but we also buy raw AI technology and models to use to develop our customer-facing AI solutions.
Right.
So we're a sort of traditional AI consumer. We're also what I would refer to as kind of almost a wholesale consumer. And then we also sell AI. So we see this from every direction that I think a company can. And what we've seen in the finance space is, again, even their use of AI from traditional providers, if it exists at all, it's extraordinarily limited. There are tons of new finance providers that are popping in to the equation and trying to get your attention. I can't wake up to more than less than 10 LinkedIn messages and text messages from, "We've got this AI tool that solves all of your headaches." And then we look at it and it doesn't. It's a point solution. There's no one who's really developing or focused on a platform play in the finance tech space. I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen anyone suggest they're doing it. And the companies that have the platforms don't seem to be making the AI investment. So I think there's just a big bridge that needs to get built between those concepts where the companies that are trying to be innovative can't break into the space because they're developing a solution that solves a real problem. And the companies that buy a lot of it need a platform that solves a lot of problems.
Right.
And if you take that innovation with that scale and fuse them together, probably have a great opportunity to grab a lot of market share in the long term. But I don't see anybody doing it. And the last thing I'd say around AI is there are a myriad of legal and price challenges that I think are underappreciated. When you look at traditional SaaS purchasing, and I've been buying SaaS software as the procurement guy for a long time, there is quite a bit of convergence and consistency in the space. You're charging per user. There might be some consumption limitations, but it's unusual to find a SaaS product that has a model that you've never heard of before and that's not similar to competitors in the same space. There's an awful lot of consistency. So it's become relatively easy to understand, to model, to forecast what you're going to spend, what you're going to utilize, what you're going to consume. And I think that's benefited the customer a lot. In the AI space, that is not the case. Every AI provider that we purchase from has a different model, a different way of measuring what a widget is. Are we buying credits? Are we buying minutes? Are we buying queries? Are we buying the number of results that we get from the queries? There's so many different flavors
Right.
that the model can take on. And that lends itself to two very discrete problems. Number one is it's confusing to buy their stuff because you have to learn the model every time you look at a new technology. You have to learn a new model of how to understand what your consumption is going to be. And that leads directly to the second challenge, which is how the hell do you forecast what you're going to spend
Right.
when it's difficult to know what costs money and how much of it there is out there. And so that's one challenge that I think will resolve itself over time. I think as AI becomes more ubiquitous, and I think as the major models become less differentiated, you'll naturally see the vendors in that space consolidate to models that are more similar and easier to purchase and transition in between. But the second, on the legal side, it probably takes a bit longer to deal with, and that is around liability, indemnification. Those kinds of legal considerations are very, very different with AI than they are with traditional software. And again, we have a lot of experience and frankly some expertise in this that most companies lack, because we're not just buying it, we're also selling it. So we have these conversations from a legal perspective on both sides of the table. And even we struggle sometimes to figure out, like, well, where should the liability for this scenario really fall? Is it on the consumer, the vendor, the user? How do you share that responsibility in a responsible and equitable manner? And I think that a lot of the legal challenges will also converge eventually as there's more consistency in the AI space. But that probably takes quite a bit longer because it's very difficult for people to conceptualize that problem and how much risk there really can be in the space, particularly when it comes to intellectual property. And so that's a barrier, I think, for a lot of larger companies to adopt AI. Is the legal considerations are profound. They're complex. And what I've witnessed and observed is a lot of larger companies just wanting to kind of hold off until it's more accessible from a legal perspective.
Right. Got it. I think 2, 3 important pointers that you covered. I love that particular aspect of, there are point solutions which are doing a lot of innovation, which is solving a problem statement. There are platforms which work across the landscape. But then, the innovation is missing in them in terms of solving these kind of problem statements. So I think the future is, where point solutioning becomes more horizontal in terms of what they are solving for. And there is that also boils down to my personal philosophy in this entire space. I believe that, one of the missing pieces or the thing that really needs attention is different use cases. Even within finance teams, right? You have AR, you have AP, you have spend management, you have treasury, you have FP&A, you have expense management, you have, the accounting, bookkeeping. You have such a lot of elements. What I believe personally is that there is a need of connectivity between different use cases. There's a need of connectivity between different data points. And because these data points are stored across so many different levels of layers, there's a need of a data warehouse which actually makes the data connected. And atop it are the AI agents or the AI automations working so that they can talk to each other because the data is connected. I think that's where the future is. That will where a platform will really function because everything is connected, everything is speaking with each other, and there is a strong level of approach towards cash flow optimization, strong approach towards understanding what is the vision of the company. Loved your answer in terms of the platform vis-a-vis point solutioning, and that's how I think the evolution of the technology is going to happen. So,
Yeah.
love your answer, right? And the other aspect you mentioned is with regards to the applications of AI. I agree. There are a lot of things happening on the AI side. Some are great, and some are working towards becoming great. Hopefully, I think pricing and legal are two. I love that. The insight pricing, especially. I love that insight because I coming from a perspective of selling AI product, I have not approached that. I did not think about that problem, but that's a very genuine problem because you're working across, as you mentioned, right? You're working across point solutionings which are providing different kinds of AI applications, and you need a benchmarking of the pricing. You need to understand that hey, this is the ROI of this particular product. To understand the ROI, the cost needs to be implemented. This needs to be benchmarking cost, and somebody does queries, somebody does users, somebody does the number of responses, and there are how will you? I know you will have to basically benchmark it based on the inputs, and each input is in a different direction.
Yeah. It's so fascinating also how
Yeah.
many different lenses you can take
Yeah.
around it. This is really eye opening. And it's something I didn't expect. But AI procurement genuinely takes a significantly longer period of time
Right.
than SaaS procurement does in the
Yeah.
current environment because of those two factors. And so, we're at a point today where if I see a procurement request come through and it's for AI, I just kind of shake my head and go, cool, here's another one. I could handle 5, 10 SaaS software negotiations in the time it takes to deal with one AI negotiation
Right.
primarily because of those two factors, because it takes time to get the model, understand it, translate it, get it into your forecasting models with your FP&A team, translate that to a language other stakeholders in the company understand, and then deal with all the back and forth from the legal teams who often don't see eye to eye on a lot of these issues. And sometimes they don't understand what the practical use case of the system is going to be. And so you've got to sort of educate them first
Right.
and then them try to determine where the risk is. And so, ClickUp, we move pretty quick. We're very fast at iterating and getting product out to market. And we're pretty fast at making purchasing decisions also. But even we have to kind of slow things down and go, okay, there's a lot of unknowns here. There's a lot of risk here that genuinely do need to be dealt with. And you have to understand those risks before you can make those decisions and sign those contracts. And so it's just a much slower process today. It'll speed up in the future, but people wondering sort of why AI is not more utilized by larger corporations now, I think a lot of it actually has to do with the two considerations. It's not that the users and the business stakeholders don't want the AI systems. It's that it's very difficult because there's somebody like me going, hey, slow down. Let's make sure we know exactly what we're getting into and
Right.
we've mitigated the risk appropriately.
Got it. It's a really fresh approach and new approach to the approach to the entire applications of tech and AI. So we'll move to the final question, and love to know. I mean, what would be the advice that you will give to finance professionals to grow into a finance leadership?
Well, the first is you have to understand your own sort of personal motivations and your own and sort of your own personal journey, right? You can't lead an organization if you can't lead yourself first. So you've got to find different ways to challenge yourself, grow your knowledge, grow your level of discipline and understanding. That could be finding different routines. It could be investing in courses, reading different books, finding, exercise routines, diet routines. But you have to find different ways to ensure that you're really taking care of yourself first before you can help others. I view it as kind of, if you're on an airplane and the mask comes down, they tell you, put your mask on before you help somebody else or you won't be able to. And I think that's often overlooked by people who are highly ambitious is if you're sort of moving too fast and taking on too much from a leadership perspective, you're not doing yourself a great service, and you're certainly not doing the employees underneath you a great service if you don't have your own act together and you don't have your own responsibilities handled in your personal life and at home. And so you should know. The second advice I'd give is that you are responsible for owning your professional growth. And it's something that our CFO ClickUp is kind of into us repeatedly. I think it's, you have to own your own growth. And he's absolutely right. If you're not being responsible for your professional growth, you can't expect somebody else to take on that responsibility. You have to own your development plan. You have to prioritize it. You have to make sure that you're executing. And the higher you get, the more important that becomes, because the fewer people that are going to be looking at you going, hey, you didn't hit this KPI last month. It's you know, it's at my level, I'm responsible for reporting that stuff myself in many cases. And so you've got to make sure that you've got the perspective and the integrity to do that appropriately, to own up to mistakes that you make, to hold yourself accountable, but to also be responsible for your own journey until we get to the point that AI agents can literally do it for us. We're there in some micro levels, but we're not there in a macro sense. And I think it's going to be a long time before we get there. You have to make sure that you are putting people first. Your organization, the people underneath you, are your responsibility. You've got to take care of them. And you also have to ensure that you're communicating well across the organization, that you're not siloing yourself. So every problem in business is a people problem to some degree. And I think that's very easy for finance professionals to overlook. And I think that's a big mistake when it happens.
Got it. I think loved your answer, especially on the people aspect of it. That's, I think, one very important aspect, because if you want to grow to become a leader, you need to grow with your people. You need to understand where people function the best, and if something is not happening, how is it people related. So love the answer. I think I had a great time recording the podcast with you, Jason. Had an amazing gala time. We spoke on a gamut of things. I hope our viewers find the podcast really well. But thanks for being our part of the podcast, Jason.
Thank you for having me. Had a great time.
Thanks everybody for joining the podcast. I hope you had a great time. See you soon.